engine dyno versus chassis dyno. So how much power do you gain going from the chassis dyno to the engine dyno? How much power do you lose going from the engine dyno to the chassis dyno? Is it a strict percentage? Is it 10%, 15%, 20%? The reality is it's not a fixed percentage, although sometimes it is. Confused? Let's find out why. In this video, we've got two direct back-to-back tests going from the chassis dyno directly on to the engine dyno, so we can find out what the power difference is. The first one is on a 1975 Dodge Tradesman van powered by a 360. That's right, we ran the 360, took it out, and put it on the engine dyno. And the next one is on a 6-liter LS2. In fact, on that combination, we're going to do one better. There are actually 3 different comparisons. So we took the motor, ran it on the chassis dyno, and then ran it on the engine dyno. Then we made modifications on the engine dyno. Then we took that modified motor, stuck it back in the car, and ran it again on the chassis dyno. So we compared the modifications on the chassis dyno, the modifications on the engine dyno, and then the change between going from the chassis dyno to the engine dyno with no modifications. That's a lot to cover. Let's get going. When people are talking about comparing chassis dynos to engine dyno numbers, they like to use a strict percentage. Oh, it's making this at the wheel, so it must make this much at the flywheel because we have this percentage of drivetrain loss. And here's one example where I think you might be able to do this, but here are also the problems associated with that one example where you might be able to use it. Let's say you have a bone stock factory vehicle. Let's say it's a new Camaro or Mustang or whatever it is, and you take the factory rated power output. You then run your bone stock car on the chassis dyno and you get some sort of power number at the wheels. And you go, okay, I have making this at the wheels, the factory rated power output is this, I can divide those numbers and come up with the drivetrain loss associated with driving my drivetrain. Now, that's going to be a strict percentage, and on a factory rated power output in a factory combination, you can kind of get away with that. But here's the problem with that. There are a couple of things. First of all, we're assuming that the factory rated power output is fixed and then all of them make exactly the same power. If we even assume that, which is okay, take a look at your drivetrain. If you have a stick car, the power output that you get on the chassis dyno is going to be different than if you have an automatic car. So right off the bat, there's going to be a difference between those two. And if you use that power output number that you get on the chassis dyno and compare it to the factory rated power output, it's going to be different between a stick and an automatic. No big surprise there. Here's the other problem is, it depends on what chassis dyno you run your test on. Even though the drivetrain is the same and the engine is the same and the rated power output is the same, if you run your motor or run your car on a chassis dyno, if you run it on a DynoJet or a Land & Sea or a Superflow or a hub dyno, the number you generate on that test facility is going to be different. So then if you then take that different number and compare it to our fixed factory power output, you're going to get a different percentage. So right off the bat, in the one instance where I think, yeah, it might be possible to use that as a strict percentage, there are problems associated with that. And there are other problems too, and we're going to talk about that stuff right now. Our discussion about the factory rated power output of a given combination brings up an important point. When I do testing at West Tech or wherever I do the testing at, and I run a motor on the dyno, let's say I run a 5.3 liter LM7 that I get from the wrecking yard because that's where all the good motors come from, and I run it on the dyno, typically they make about, let's say, 355 horsepower. Now, I get comments like this all the time from my videos and stories that I've done. Well, that motor was rated at 285 or 295 or 300 depending on the combination, and you're making 355. So that dyno must be really happy. That's not the case. The dyno doesn't care what the motor is or the guy that's controlling it or anything. It doesn't care about any of that. But here's the difference between the factory rated power output and what we get or what I get on the engine dyno, and other people too, because they're going to run theirs usually different than the factory does. When the factory runs a motor and rates a factory motor, they run it in the following condition. So they run it the way that it is in the car. It's run on an engine dyno and not a chassis dyno. But when they run it on the engine dyno, it has all of the factory stuff on it. It has factory exhaust manifolds, complete factory exhaust, cat back, everything. It also has all of the accessories on it, the water pump, air conditioning, power steering, alternator, all of that stuff. It also has all of the factory air intake. It has the throttle body and the tubes and the air silencer and the filter and the mass air meter. It has all of that stuff the way that it appears in the car. It's also run at temperature with the conservative factory tune. So that's the way that they rate it. Now, when I run stuff on the dyno, when we run our junkyard motors, I don't run it in that manner. I normally run it with long tube headers and a good 3-inch exhaust. Sometimes I run it with stock exhaust manifolds, and I'll mention that in the video when I do that. But I also run it with no accessories. So we normally just run an electric water pump because it's much easier to do the 100 cam swaps that I'm going to do, or what else we have to do to tear the motor apart. So we run it with no accessories, an electric water pump. We also run it with an open throttle body normally, or sometimes a radius entry. Now I normally run it a little colder than the factory does, and I always run it with an optimized tune. So we get everything out of it in each combination so that we know that that's all that the motor had to offer. So when we run it with those changes, it's very important to note that it usually makes more power than the factory is rated at. But if you took that factory motor and ran it the way that we ran it, that's what they do. I mean, if they're doing it from the wrecking yard with 200,000 miles, they're certainly going to do it when it's brand new. And a lot of other guys run motors differently. So it's important to note that's the way that they run it. And all you're looking for is a starting point, and then you make a change and look for the end point. So you're basically just looking for the difference. So now let's see how that translates to going to the chassis dyno. When we start to compare our engine dyno numbers versus chassis dyno numbers, it's important to note what we mentioned before in the previous section, and those are the way that we test the motor, because those are going to have a big effect on what the numbers are on the chassis dyno, irrespective of the losses associated with the drivetrain, which is a thing that you're trying to test. So if we run our motor on the engine dyno, and I run it with headers and an open exhaust and no accessories, just an electric water pump and an open throttle body, and we run it cold with an optimized tune, and then we take that motor and we put it in a vehicle, there are a number of changes that need to take place that take power away from that have nothing to do with the drivetrain losses. So if we then put a mechanical pump and accessories on there, like an alternator, the water pump, and maybe air conditioning or power steering, and then we put an air intake assembly on there, which most people would run on any form of racing and even on a street car, maybe the exhaust is going to be different. Maybe they still run headers like we did, but they usually would have a longer exhaust. You know, if it's a street car, they're going to put cats on it. All of that stuff, and they're usually going to run it at a different temperature than we run on the engine dyno. So all of those things are going to reduce the power output of that motor even before we add the drivetrain to the list, which is a whole nother thing. And we'll talk about the drivetrain in just a second. So it's important to note, when we go from the engine dyno to the chassis dyno, you need to know if those kinds of changes take place before you can start looking at percentages of change. Now we're going to get into like the meat of the video, and that's the drivetrain losses. That's the important stuff. And the best way to do this is, I find, is to look at like extreme examples. So I'm going to show you why, we're going to demonstrate why it's not the drivetrain is not a fixed percentage based on the power output of the motor. So as you go up in power on the chassis dyno, you actually don't go up in drivetrain losses, at least not very much. So let's use an example. Suppose we have a trophy truck motor that runs on the engine dyno, and it's a big inch small block with the stack injection and all that stuff. Let's say it makes 800 horsepower, and that's a good motor. And then we go put it in a trophy truck, and the drivetrain losses, let's say, are 20%. So we're losing 160 horsepower through that. So now our 800 horsepower motor on the engine dyno is now making 640 horsepower at the tire on the chassis dyno. In reality, it's probably quite a bit, it'll make quite a bit less than that because there'll be more drivetrain losses. But let's take a look at what those drivetrain losses are. Let's assume that we ran it exactly the same on the engine dyno as we did on the chassis dyno, and all those losses were just the drivetrain. So we have, first of all, the transmission. So in something like that, it might be a manual valve body, turbo 400, it's going to be a big beefy transmission because it has to be able to take the power output of the motor plus all the abuse that goes along with moving a super heavy truck and jumping over mountains and crawling rocks and do all the stuff that they do. You're also going to have a big beefy drive shaft, again, because it has to take all of that abuse, and that carries over to the rear end. It's going to be some big super 9-inch with at least 35 spline axles. Everything's going to be big and beefy and heavy and take a lot of power to turn. Now the big thing in all of this are actually the wheels and tires. These wheels and tires, in addition to being gigantic size, they're super heavy because they have to be really big and beefy, again, because they're taking a lot of abuse. So this drivetrain saps up a ton of power. It sapped up, in this case, 160 horsepower. So we go, okay, yeah, that's great. That's 20%. That's an easy number to remember. Here's why it's not 20%. Let's say that we were to take that trophy truck motor out, our 800 horsepower motor out, and we ran a single cam VTEC Honda motor on the engine dyno that made 130 horsepower. Now we take that 130 horsepower motor and put it in our trophy truck with that same drivetrain. So if we use our 20%, now our drivetrain is 20% of 130 horsepower. That means our drivetrain now is only consuming, it only takes 26 horsepower to turn that drivetrain. The reality is that there's no way that that can be possible. It doesn't do that. As a matter of fact, in that case, that motor would have a hard time spinning, even just spinning that drivetrain, because that drivetrain takes a lot to spin. It uses up a lot of power. It might eventually get the thing going, but it's certainly not going to do it with any sort of spirited excitement. So that's the thing. It's not a fixed number. And if we look at another thing, if you have a motor, if you have a car on the chassis dyno, and let's say you're making 400 horsepower and you put a supercharger on it, and now you've added boost to it and you're making 600 horsepower. So you've improved the power output by 200 horsepower, and let's say that your drivetrain losses, that you calculated your drivetrain losses at 20% at that 400 horsepower number. It's still not 20% at the 600 horsepower number. Your drivetrain losses have not gone up because you have not changed your drivetrain at all. There's a small frictional increase when you go up in power, but it's very, very tiny. Your drivetrain losses are almost fixed. It takes this amount of power to spin that transmission and the converter and the pump if it's an automatic, that drive shaft, those wheels and tires, that drivetrain. They don't increase, and that's the thing. People don't realize that, oh, they put a 1,000 horsepower motor on the chassis dyno and driving through the transmission and think, oh, that's 20%. Some guys even use 25. And that's where this percentage comes in. It comes in by sometimes unscrupulous people running something on the chassis dyno and trying to inflate the number that this thing makes at the flywheel so they can have a bigger number. Because whenever we run something on the engine dyno, it makes more power than it does on the chassis dyno. So big numbers always look good. So guys are always going to say, oh yeah, that's a 20% loss or 25 or even 30%, which is kind of ridiculous. The drivetrain stuff is almost fixed with a very tiny percentage of increase in friction as you go up in power. So now let's take a look at our two examples where we went directly from the chassis dyno to the engine dyno, and guess what? They both had different percentages. Our first example, unfortunately, and I don't have video on either one of these, I only have photos of this stuff because this was done long ago, but my first one is a 1975 Dodge Tradesman van with a 360 and an automatic. Now, look for a video on the modifications we made to this motor once I took it out of the vehicle, and after running it on the chassis dyno, we put it on the engine dyno. So I'm going to do a video on the modifications we did to this motor once we put it on the engine dyno, because we did some cool stuff. I mean, we ran it bone stock basically, and then we did all the normal cool things. We did headers, we did 2 different camshafts, we did ported heads, we did different induction systems, we did roller rockers, we did a lot of cool stuff. And I'm glad that I found all of this information on the Dodge, because I know the Dodge guys have been hounding me for this. But so we can just talk about what happened when we ran this. When I ran my 1975 Tradesman van on the chassis dyno, it's a 2-barrel equipped 360, so it's not very stellar, and it was rated at something near 180 horsepower. I couldn't actually find the 75 rating. I found the 74, and that was 180 horsepower. But at any rate, this basically stock 2-barrel 360 made a whopping 155 horsepower at the tire, which is, you know, it's a little embarrassing. But we then took that motor out because I was going to use it on the chassis or on the engine dyno to do a bunch of modifications on. So I took it out and we put it on the engine dyno, and I took it out with the stock exhaust manifolds. We ran the stock exhaust that was in the van. I ran the mechanical water pump. I ran the factory air cleaner. So I tried to make it as close as the way that it was in the van as possible. And we ran it on the engine dyno, and it made, again, another whopping 225 horsepower at the flywheel. So if you do the multiplication, you look at the difference between there, we lost 70 horsepower going from the engine dyno down to the chassis dyno. And if you use your calculations, do 70% of 155. That's a really big number. Even if you did 70% of the, or 70 horsepower compared to the 225, that's still a big number. You're talking about 45, I think, or 30%. And I'll go ahead and put a text up here and remind myself. But you're looking at a big percentage. And the reality is, it's not that big a percent. It's just like with our Honda engine example in our trophy truck. The reason that the percentage is so high is because the power output of the motor is so low. The drivetrain losses are basically fixed. It's just that we didn't have very much motor, and so the percentage number of what all of that drivetrain takes up is higher on a smaller output motor. So now let's get to the second test where I've got dyno data and all kinds of cool stuff. LS2. Our second test was run on a 6-liter LS2 motor, and this particular combination was installed in a 240SX. It was a drift car equipped with a 6-speed manual trans. Now, our test motor was basically a stock LS2. It did have a fast intake manifold and a set of 1 3/4 long tube headers. As I said, it was run through a manual 6-speed trans installed in the 240SX. It was obviously tuned to perfection, so it ran really well. So equipped the LS2 equipped with the headers and the fast manifold and tuned in the 240SX with the manual trans produced 394 horsepower and 409 foot-pounds of torque. So after we ran it on the chassis dyno, we installed it up on the engine dyno. So here are the numbers we ran on the chassis dyno. Here's what happened after we put this motor up on the engine dyno. Run on the engine dyno, our headered and intake manifold LS2 produced 476 horsepower and 465 foot-pounds of torque. So if you do some comparisons, if we do some quick math here, we see that going from the engine dyno, or to the chassis dyno to the engine dyno, it would change the power output by 82 horsepower. So if you do some math, you can divide 82 by 476, which is the number we got on the engine dyno, and you have a change of about 17.2%. Now, if you divide that same 82 by the original number on the chassis dyno, 394, you get about 20.8%. So you could pick either one. You know, you're just manipulating with math. So now let's take a look and see what happened after doing our change going from the chassis dyno to the engine dyno. Now we're going to do some upgrades to the motor on the engine dyno. After removing our mild LS2 and running it on the chassis dyno on that 240SX, we installed it on the engine dyno, and it was making 476 horsepower and 465 horsepower, but naturally that's not enough. You got to upgrade this thing. We need to make more power. Everything needs to make more power. So what we did was replace the factory cylinder heads, 243 heads, which are pretty good, but they can be better, and the camshaft, which definitely can be better. So we replaced those with a set of ported 243 heads from the guys at Total Engine Airflow. They do a good job over there. And porting a set of factory 243 heads, definitely a good idea. That makes a ton of power. We combine that with a healthy comp cam because every LS motor needs a better cam. That cam was the 54 469-11 cam, which is a 617/624 lift split, and a 231/247 degree duration split and 113 degree lobe separation angle. Here's what happened when we installed our heads and camshaft on our LS2. Boom! Big power! So the power output on the LS2 jumped up to 560 horsepower. Well, technically it's 559.9, but we rounded up that last tenth of a horsepower. You guys got to give me that. 560 horsepower and 494 foot-pounds of torque. You can see down here below 4,000 we have a little bit of a loss, but it was almost nothing, and I would definitely trade that for these huge power gains. So if we do a little bit of math here and we see that we went from 476 horsepower to 560 horsepower, depending on which number you divide it by, that was an increase of 84 horsepower. So if we divide that by 560, we got a 15% increase in power. And if we divide it by 476, we got a 17.6% increase in power. And we'll be using those numbers later on to compare the percentage gain when we now put this thing back in the car and run this same test and compare it to our baseline test on the chassis dyno. So let's check that out. Okay guys, now things are really starting to get good. So we ran the motor on the engine dyno, did our cylinder head and camshaft upgraded on the LS2 on the engine dyno, and then took it off the engine dyno and reinstalled it back in the car so we could run it again on the chassis dyno. So as you'll remember, run on the chassis dyno, the LS2 with the fast intake and headers produced 394 horsepower. So here's what happened after we installed the modified version back in the vehicle. Obviously, it was making a lot more power as it did on the engine dyno. So run on the chassis dyno, this combination produced 461 horsepower and 428 foot-pounds of torque, so it was doing very well. And I know right off the bat, and I want you guys to make comments, why the heck didn't you guys rev it out farther when you were running the baseline combination with just the intake manifold and the long tube headers? We definitely should have. I mean, I wasn't in charge of the chassis dyno, and I would normally like to run it out farther so I can do a better comparison. But here's what I can say. When we ran it on the engine dyno, it made peak power at 6,200. This was 6,100. So the power curve would just be falling off after that. So the relative differences, or the peak numbers that we're going to talk about, still the same. That's not a big deal. Although I would like to see the curve out there. I mean, I'm a dyno curve guy, so it would be much better. But still, this is a really good comparison. So we went from 394 horsepower to 461 horsepower. So if you do the comparison, we picked up 67 horsepower on the dyno. And if you do your multiplication, if you compare the 67 horsepower gain to 461, we get 14.5% change. And if you compare it to the 394 number, we get a 17% comparison, or 17% change, which both of those numbers, incidentally, are very, very close to the percentage gains that we got on the engine dyno. So relatively speaking, our modifications did the same kind of changes. So it's there you go, some fun with math. But it's important to note that on the engine dyno, the numbers are higher than they are on the chassis dyno, but the relative gains that we get remain the same. Let's get to our conclusion. Okay guys, what did you think about our comparison on the Super Dodge Tradesman and the LS2 drift car, chassis dyno versus engine dyno? I'm going to make this really quick. There's only one thing you got to remember. It's not a percentage. I mean, we multiplied the percentage and we went over all that stuff, but it's not a percentage. Your drivetrain losses are basically fixed. Whatever it takes to rotate that transmission and drive shaft and rear end and tires and wheels, that's kind of a fixed deal. It goes up a little bit of a percentage when you increase the power, but not the same number. I'm Richard Holder, guys. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell. More stuff coming up, and Dodge fans, look for that 360 video.